Our first panel is, the topic is international security and human rights, and I'd like to take a moment to introduce our panelists. So we will we'll go in order here from your left to your right. So immediately to my left I have Joss Wright. Joss Wright is a fellow at the Oxford Internet Institute. He does research in a variety of areas, including cryptography, privacy-enhancing technologies, and anonymous communications. And his current research focus is in analyzing internet censorship and data anonymization. Our second panelist is Zeynep Tufekci, who's an assistant professor at North Carolina Chapel Hill in the School of Information and Library Sciences. She has a number of other affiliations. She's also a faculty associate at the Harvard Berkman Center, and previously she was also here at CITP as a fellow. Her research is in a variety of things, including big data, social media, and the role of technology in catalyzing social movements. Finally, our third panelist is Hans Klein, who's an associate professor in the School of Public Policy at Georgia Tech. Hans and I have a long history of actually working together, and his research interests lie in internet governance, globalization and regulation, development of large-scale systems, intelligent transportation systems, and so forth. He received his PhD from the political science program at MIT in the program in tech policy. So this first panel is on the topic of international security and human rights. So there are a couple of questions there that I've sort of jotted down to seed discussion, so you can have a look at those and sort of use that to kind of jog your thinking as we hear from our panelists. What I've asked each of our panelists to do is speak for about 10 or 15 minutes on this topic, and I think we're going to hear some interesting viewpoints based on what I saw in the preparation. And so let's. I'm going to suggest that we start with Hans and then just go from right to left.
Okay. Thank you, Nick. Good to be here at CITP. Good to see you again here, Nick. I'm giving some larger, big picture comments here as part of it seems appropriate for the opening panel here. And I want to urge us, we're here to talk about censorship and think about censorship, and I want us to perhaps think about broadening our conception of censorship and some of the issues that we're facing here. We tend to think of censorship, and I think perhaps it's the way it's been used here, somewhat as an unequivocal bad thing. Here we are, we're involved, and we're supporters of and experts in information technology. Technology allows for communication. Communication is a good thing. It allows for free speech. We have right to free speech. Censorship is in opposition to that. It opposes and suppresses the benefits of speech and of communication. And we see around the world examples of censorship and opposition to the use of the internet, blocking of the internet, and so on. Those are important issues. We should be aware of them. I think it's appropriate and good that we are not only researchers of information technology and communication, but to a certain extent, many of us in this room are also advocates of information technology, advocates of communication, advocates of free speech, and implicitly or explicitly critics of censorship and opponents of censorship. However, I told Nick I was going to problematize this issue as kind of make things a little bit more nuanced as a way to start off the day. So I think I do want to problematize our opposition to censorship and get us to look a little bit at the complexities around the issues of control of communication and what would be effective and appropriate advocacy for free speech and for good communication. And I want to look at the idea that information technology and free speech is always a positive thing, because I think in some cases it can also have a downside, a negative side, and sometimes that downside and negative side can be extremely severe, so much that it arguably counterbalances or can even outweigh the benefits of free speech. And if we are going to advocate information technology that allows for communication, I think we should be aware also not only of the positive uses, but of the negative uses of the technologies and the harms that can be caused by that, so that we have a more nuanced and appropriate position, and even an advocacy, and also perhaps that our advocacy can be broader, not only to support information technology, but to support other policies and actions that can lead to the misuse of information technology and to some of the significant disbenefits of the application of information technology. So I'm going to consider this in two contexts: the use and the use and misuse of IT, the IT that brings us here together. In the context of domestic society and in the context of international relations, we can both see the benefits of information technology and sometimes the disbenefits of information technology. So domestically, in society, obviously we hear a lot about this. Free speech promotes democracy. It promotes participation, citizen participation in governance processes. Information technology is essential to freedom of association, whereby people can come together, develop a collective voice, and together advocate for their own interests or for causes that they feel strongly about. There can be a downside to uses of information technology in the domestic arena. That can be in the area of social stability. There are societies, many societies, that are not really composed so much of individual citizens. They may be composed of ethnic groups or tribal groups or historically divided groups, and at times speech can be used and information technology can be used not to promote democratic participation, but to promote conflict. And you can see speech used to foment conflict among groups, among pre-existing social groups, be they tribes, ethnicities, and so on. So we are familiar with certain regulations of speech against hate speech. It's debated in the United States, and certainly in Europe and throughout the world, there's cases of regulations on speech for racism and fomenting violence and so on. So that's one area where there is a debate on the twin values of free speech, association, democracy on one side, and the other value, social stability, nonviolence, peaceful social relations on the other side. Information technology can be used in either of those directions. In the international context, we also see the pros and cons of information technology and free speech. The positive dimension, again, international global human rights. The UN Charter of Human Rights, Article 19, asserts a right for freedom of expression. Information technology enhances that. It promotes human rights at the global level. At the same time, in international relations, information technology can be used, arguably, to undermine the national security and the security of peoples within their domestic societies and in their international relations. Somewhat related to the first point, to foment destabilization that can provide an opportunity for the kind of nasty things that sometimes happen in international relations, which can be coup, invasion, outsiders supporting violence in the domestic arena. So in both of these cases, yes, free speech is good. Censorship, we question it, but we can also acknowledge that there's a danger domestically of instability and violence, and internationally of interference in domestic affairs, instability and violence as well. I'm going to cite three cases that I think demonstrate the dangers of free speech here. And they're familiar to us all. There were three cases where we saw so-called Twitter revolutions against authoritarian governments that looked like a really good thing. In the cases, I'm going to cite Libya, Syria, and the Ukraine. In each of those cases, I think an objective assessment of the governments of those countries would not be a very favorable assessment. Certainly, Syria ranked pretty high in authoritarian governance. Libya, maybe not as much as Syria, but again, not a democratic institute, not a democratic society. The Ukraine, famously suffering from corruption. And in each of these cases, good news. We had internet-based social activism, people out engaged in the power of association. Looks like democratic movements going forward. Fast forward a few years, and it's like, wow, the results aren't that great. In fact, the alternative that was launched to an authoritarian governance seems to be no governance. So we have a really nasty civil war in Syria. We have essentially a civil war in Libya. We've got a civil war in the Ukraine. In each case, we have social instability, violence, a breakdown in governance. So at minimum, if we're going to advocate information technology, we have to think and possibly take some responsibility for what we advocate. Great, people are using our tools, they're engaged in free association. Then perhaps we should have some doubts about what's happened in these societies and perhaps the role that our own advocacy has played in it. Do we here bear some responsibility for breakdown in governance, breakdown in social order, and the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people? What's happened in those societies has been a very terrible thing. It bothers me on a daily basis, and I'm sure it bothers many of us here. So, information technology, free speech, and countering a free speech is, I think, we've been doing this long enough to recognize, to adopt a more nuanced perspective, that there's very positive benefits, but there's dangers as well, and that censorship sometimes censorship policies are policies to defend against destabilization, to defend against breakdown of social order, to defend against civil war. So if we take a more nuanced view of information technology, how we could advocate for it, how it can be best applied, we might also consider how to create an environment in which the benefits of information technology can be best realized. What makes the world safe for democracy, for civil society, for information technology, for the use of social media? So I used to be the chairperson of an organization called Computer Professionals for Social Responsibility. It was one of the first NGOs in this area. It disbanded itself a few years back with the emergence of, I think, more professional NGOs in this area. What gave a launch to Computer Professionals for Social Responsibility was the militarization of the field of computer science. It was in the 80s, under the Reagan administration, the Star Wars policies really brought a lot of resources to computer science, but also in the service of national defense and possibly even more than national defense. And today we might be seeing something similar. The problems with the tools that we're developing and why they're getting some pushback is they can be used but also misused. It seems that online communication, association, free speech can be used in the service of destabilization, militarization, fomenting war, breakdown in governance, and so on. So I think as we advocate for our tools, we may also want to advocate for policies that advocate against policies that would misuse these tools, that would make the use of information technology, social media, societal communication a positive thing. So, with that, those are my opening comments. Let's bear in mind in the course of the day, yes, the technology is powerful. Yes, it can do enormous good. Yes, a lot of censorship policies are bad, and it would be wonderful to have a world in which there was less, or well, certainly less controls and less censorship, but perhaps that involves an awareness and even an advocacy for the peaceful uses of social media and the internet. Thank you.
All right. Okay. Well, that was very provocative. We had been talking about this last night, too. So I do want to say that what we're talking about here is thrusting most of the planet to a U.S. First Amendment framework within the space of a couple of years. And U.S. itself didn't get thrust into the First Amendment framework until the 60s, basically. If you know the legal history, this kind of speech with more speech is a fairly recent jurisprudence. And in fact, it is clearly easier when you're surrounded by two oceans, Canada and Mexico, than if you are in other places. So that is true. And I will argue that has had major implications. I would like to say, though, in the Middle East and North African uprisings, they've always, every revolution brings these risks of decades of turmoil, and it was true in Europe too. In the 19th century, it took the French Revolution 70 years to settle down on a lot of blood. So that is a way of saying that institutional support for emerging democracies as they try to emerge was sorely lacking in this world. We did not support them. And I have a lot of friends from all of those countries. Some of them are in jail, some of them are in exile. And they were abandoned, basically, to their authoritarians in that process. So I think we should just bring in sort of the historical examples. So it wasn't just that they didn't have the tools. They didn't. That is true. We also did not go and support them. And that what happened, what played out, is what has played out in other parts of the world historically, too, when you have breakdown of an authoritarian state and no institutional structures to replace it. So I think fascinating conversation there. But I do want to argue a little bit that we're now living in a post-censorship world, effectively, and I'm going to tell you guys what it means. Despite all the examples of censorship we can discuss, it happens all the time. I'm originally from Turkey, so I have a lot of history of censorship, and I have a lot of current history of watching the Turkish government try to censor whatever it can get its hands on. Basically, at the moment, they just seem to be trying very hard. And I have lived through the previous era of censorship in Turkey, where there was genuine censorship in the sense that I grew up not knowing what was going on in the Kurdish southeast. They told us they killed a bunch of terrorists. I kind of figured out that it was a lie at some point because it was clear the government was lying about lots of things. Never had any reliable information. And demonstrations and marches for peace and things were shot at with live bullets, so that kind of shut down the conversation there too. So I lived through that era of really not knowing what was going on at all. That was the mass media era. I then studied the emergence of people discovering social media and the power of breaking censorship in Turkey during the Gezi Park protests that happened in just like 2 years ago. And here's just the 1-minute synopsis of what happened is the government had been elected fairly 3 times in a row, but had been growing what we would call majoritarian authoritarianism, in which you capture the parliament and then you try and go and gut every other institution, that old boring checks and balances things that I've come to really appreciate is important. So there was growing authoritarianism within a democracy. And this is not unique to Turkey. There's a lot of countries where people come to power electorally and then try to capture the state power. Okay. One of the things they had done was capture mass media by either threatening the bosses or making business deals with them. So mass media was either self-censoring or censoring on behalf of the government. It got really worse and worse over the years. It's not like we ever had any reasonable media, but it got awful. And then there was a small protest in Taksim, Gezi Park. They wanted to turn it into a shopping mall. The local people didn't want it. You know, it was a small protest. It's a very central area. It's like New York, Soho kind of area. It's very hip and young. They shopping mall. They wanted to build a replica of Ottoman barracks there. It was just awful. Anyway, so while the protest was going on, the television stations wouldn't show it. People started, like, Turkey's a very wired country. People started tweeting about it, talking to each other about it, and more people showed up. And the police tear gassed them and sort of tried to repress them. The televisions didn't show it. The more people showed up because they heard it on, social media, and then television still didn't show it. At one point, it was so ridiculous that CNN International was broadcasting live from the center of Istanbul because the clashes had gotten so big, like in second day, tens of thousands of people clashing with the police. CNN Turkey was showing a documentary on penguins at the same time. So somebody put the 2 TVs together, CNN International live from Istanbul, the second day into clashes. CNN Turkey, waddle, waddle, waddle. I mean, it was ridiculous because there was no feasible way to keep this news under wraps. And tens of thousands of people showed up I got on a plane, I showed up. I mean, who's going to miss that? In my home country is having a social media fueled, movement. And during that time, I did formal interviews, hundreds of people. I stayed in the park. I got tear gas, which compared to the 90s in Turkey wasn't that bad. People discovered that they could connect to each other and find out. So what happened after that was this enormous awareness on using social media, internet, phones to get the news. I talked to person after person in their teens, 18, 19, 20, who told me, now they've been telling us the Kurds are a terrorist on that TV that's now lying about me, and next time something happens in Kurdish Southeast, I am going to go find somebody who's tweeting from there, and I'm going to get the news directly. So there was this enormous awareness among a large segment of the population that their television was censored. You could just open your window and smell the tear gas and not have it on TV. So it's one of the highest Twitter use in the world. It's just like everybody's on it. It's not like here. Twitter is the tip of the iceberg. Everybody uses WhatsApp. It's an enormous, it's not visible to us because it's not public, and the country is mostly on Facebook, and it's got some of the best citizen journalism infrastructures, very bright kids, and all of that. So this sounds great, right? Now, that's why the government is trying to censor Twitter. And Twitter, to its credit, is actually complying as much dragging feet as it can. These country held without things, you can go to Twitter and change your own country from your own settings, and you can then access it. Or you can use a VPN. And as far as I can tell, government's attempts at shutting down websites, which is enormous. They've shut down like 50,000 websites. They've shut down thousands of Twitter accounts. They've shut down Facebook pages. They've shut down Twitter and YouTube and Facebook for weeks. As far as I can tell, there's no effective consequence in that, which is what I am coming to next, is the post-censorship world, is that the battle is shifted to what it probably always was. The battle is shifted to a battle of legitimacy. It's a battle of whose information is correct. There is no longer in Turkey an effective regime in which if you do want to find something out, that you cannot find a fairly straightforward way to access some information. But here's what's going on. There is no way to tell what is actually going on. And I say this as someone who has, right now, there's a test case, which has been so eye-opening for me. The Kurdish insurgency has reignited. Just take that as a given now. The politics of it is very complicated. The government has thrown out journalists from the region. They even imprisoned the vice journalist, Fixer, for using encryption just to discourage foreign media. There are no journalists on the ground in Kurdish areas right now outside of Kurdish press. I can no longer reliably tell what's going on besides awful things are going on. And I have watched again and again where some news comes out, and the part of Turkey that is online, it's 50% of the country is online, at least. It's probably more. If you're a government supporter, you look at a picture and you say, that's fake. Then you say it's Photoshop. And then you say, well, it was an aberration. And then the government people who are said to be, like Russia, employed by the government, come and flood the place with misinformation. And then there's trolls. And then you get drowned in people who are confusing to you. Now, I, as a person who has lots of friends there, people I follow directly, lots of journalist friends, I can no longer tell when I see a photograph or a picture of something that is awful, I can't really contextualize it. I scream on it on Twitter. Like, there was a curfew in Cizre for 9 days, which I thought was an awful human rights violation. I know there's 20 people dead. The government claims the PKK killed them. A lot of people claim the government killed them. If you do not already believe one side, there is no way for you to tell what the heck is going on. So, and what is the legitimacy part come into this? And this is why, this is a very complex thing. The government has recognized, I'm not talking about China, China is the only exception, that they cannot censor this world anymore. What they have done is they have gone all out to demonize the media. So what they have done is they have basically convinced their own supporters that internet, online, Twitter news is corrupt, that it's awful, that there's a lot of abuse there. They have picked on cases where Twitter did not before obey the laws in Turkey, in which the people victimized had a case. There was a case of a woman in the Black Sea region who had someone maliciously impersonating her on Twitter as if she were a porn star. Now, this is really not a case speech solves it. For her, this reputational damage was serious. She was so distraught that she went to court trying to stop this. Twitter wasn't obeying the court orders. She suffered from this situation for many, many months because Twitter wasn't obeying the court orders from Turkey as a free speech stance or as a corporate we don't care stance. It doesn't terribly matter. The prime minister has used this example in every rally, saying, look, this is what Twitter does. It lets people be victimized in this particular way. So when you tell Twitter, like, don't obey a country's laws, what you're doing is, well, the law sucks. I mean, I hate the way Turkey's censoring everything, and the courts have been hollowed out. So I'm not really claiming the laws are great. I'm just sort of saying there's a battle for legitimacy here. And the idea that the US law is the only law that works in the world, as much as I mostly like the First Amendment, is not something that is going to work globally. Countries, people have different standards for libel. They have different standards for what they care reputationally. They have different considerations in the public sphere. So even if they are not truly democratic in the full sense like Turkey, the people there don't really think most of the time, especially if they are kind of sympathetic to the government, that it's okay for this online First Amendment regime just to come to the country with no accountability. Now, of course, it's also not a great thing if Twitter or Facebook or YouTube censors everything on behalf of the Turkish government, because these are essential places. To give you an example, I had this argument publicly, privately, publicly over the many, many years with Facebook, because it was censoring Kurdish content on its own. Not the Turkish government. Facebook was constantly censoring Kurdish content if it had anything that resembled a PKK, which is the Kurdish insurgent group, anything. So that is a bit like censoring all Irish pages as accomplices of the IRA if they had a leprechaun on them, right? It was so overboard that the mayor of Diyarbakir couldn't keep a Facebook page. Because, you know, there would be a rally and somebody would be waving green, red, and yellow, which is kind of Kurdish colors, and Facebook would shut it down. It was ridiculous. Why was Facebook doing it? They were doing it for years during the era when the Turkish government was allowing Kurdish content, was not really censoring it. Facebook itself was censoring it because it played along with State Department rules, which 20-some years ago had classified the PKK as a terrorist group, which was true, but there was a peace process. You see what I'm saying? So by following US considerations from decades ago to the letter, Facebook itself was massively censoring a particular kind of content in a setting where mass media was very censored. Well, I'm just trying to sort of create the post-censorship world, but so people were getting around it anyway. So where do we go from here? Where we go from here, and we can have this discussion in the back and forth, is try to merge the technical considerations to circumvent censorship. I advocate for VPNs that have speed, the biggest problem in Turkey. With the political and legitimacy considerations, it cannot be that we just go and say, do not care about the law of any country because there's a legitimacy and a political battle going on. What we can do is, how can we help people around the world create their own battles for what gets to be in the public sphere without also appearing as these external actors who then get demonized, and it just gets to be even more complicated. So I will stop right there and
thank you. So let's hear a bit from Joss.
Some feedback, apparently. No, just
yeah,
this
if you
one.
want me to.
Well, I think it was to move it away from that.
We
one.
just
There
had
was some feedback.
a little bit of feedback between.
Let me I think that was what was needed just there.
Perfect.
Okay.
So, okay, thanks, Joss.
Okay, hello. So I know some people here. For the people who don't know me, I work at the Oxford Internet Institute, which is a social science faculty. My background is in computer science, which means that I find myself in this very interesting position where I'm a kind of refugee from computer science in the social science department, which is a wonderful position to be in, actually. But it really highlights for me what I love most about this particular field of research is that it requires, from my perspective, an understanding of both the technology at a deep level and the political, social, cultural context of what we're looking at. And I think that that's exactly what's been said by the two previous speakers. Speaking as somebody born and bred in the UK, I was used to almost feeling slightly disappointed that we didn't do terrible things to the internet. And Turkey was actually the place where I first came across internet censorship and actually spurred my whole desire to research this area. I found myself in a slightly more exciting position with the UK since Snowden. So there's an understanding now, I feel slightly more engaged with the debate. But to go on with the questions that Nick sort of put forward or that we discussed before this talk began, I'm going to take a slightly more abstracted approach to the topic under discussion, because I don't have the sort of direct experiences of Turkey to speak about. But I also wanted to speak because I see lots of people in the room who are sort of computer scientists, engineers, technologists, and also other people who I don't know, who I assume are hopefully not technologists. So I want to speak to our role in this debate and what's going on. I'm going to echo a lot of the comments that have been made to date. But I think that there is an ongoing dichotomy that we face between technology and political social science. I think it's something that we talk about a lot. How can we, the technologists, work with politicians or lawyers to fix these problems? Sometimes, how can we as technologists lecture to the politicians and stop them from breaking everything, is the way that we frame this debate. But without wanting to take away the fact that we're clearly people coming from different fields with different understandings, I think that one of the first things we have to try and do is to reduce this perceived gap between our communities, between the communities of the social science researchers and the technological researchers. Because I think it's an increasingly harmful debate, and I think it's increasingly useless to us to try to talk about coming together, when in fact we should be talking about just being researchers who are working on a particular area, and we need to draw on the skills that we have in each of those. Within that context, I think where I'd like to start is, what are we actually trying to do when we research internet events, internet censorship and internet filtering? Are we ultimately trying to stop internet censorship? Now, I'm sure that a lot of people in the room will nod and say, yes, we're trying to stop internet censorship, and good, because by and large I agree. But if that is actually our overall ultimate goal, how much time have we spent thinking about the best way to do that? A lot of the time we find ourselves building tools that can get around censorship. We can circumvent censorship. We're really getting a significant ability to do that. But I think that we're missing, to a large extent, the broader context of censorship or filtering, which would allow us to understand the best routes to attack it, to try and stop it, or to work it into a world that we can agree to live in. Because ultimately, a technological fix is an attempt to solve the problem in a very fast way. And as has been pointed out by both of the previous speakers, when we come to these concepts of free expression, free speech, open exchange of information, open exchange of views, these are things that you move towards very slowly. And the examples of attempting to impose democracy, attempting to impose particular sets of values on other countries, are things that haven't worked out very well in the past. So I think in researching censorship technologies and censorship policies, we need to understand our ultimate goal and accept that maybe there's going to be a slow, messy, awkward, incremental, fuzzy process to get there. One of the things that anyone who's spoken to me about censorship or filtering will have been bored of hearing about again and again, is I like to draw a distinction between the terms censorship and filtering, or terms such as filtering, blocking, manipulation of the internet, and the term censorship. Because censorship is it's a judgment. It's a loaded term. It's a normalized term. We agree that censorship is something that is stopping information from getting through or communications getting through with which we agree. Now, there are various people who will say that any blocking of information is censorship. Anything that stops the free flow of information is censorship. But we don't tend to talk about the censorship of child pornography or the censorship of hate speech. We talk about blocking hate speech. We talk about preventing hate speech, and this kind of thing. So when I research in this area, I like to make a strong distinction between observing the technological practices of filtering and blocking and how they manipulate the network, how they affect the network, and the broader contextual, socio-political, techno-social understanding of censorship and what that means for an individual country or a broader set of countries. So if we do want to address this problem, and if we agree that it's a problem, then we do obviously need a significant level of technological understanding. We need the circumvention tools. I can see chunks of the Tor project in the room, and they're obviously leading the fight in this area. But we can also look at the more infrastructural approaches rather than tools to get around it. With the increase in encryption to avoid mass surveillance, we can start to build these technologies into the fabric of the internet. But then again, we need to build legal approaches to solving these problems, as Wendy was talking about earlier very, very effectively. We already have legal approaches to restrict dual-use technologies. We have export controls. It's one of the most significant international arrangements that nearly everyone agrees on, are the restrictions on dual-use technologies. But ultimately, these restrictions are against technologies that the technical community, we the technical community, built. We build technologies to get around censorship, but at the same time, large chunks of our community have built the technologies that are being used to filter the internet, to censor the internet, to conduct mass surveillance. And that goes all the way down to the fundamental architecture of the internet. The internet has enabled a huge amount of personal communication, business communication, development of free expression and free speech around the world. But it's also the most amazing censorship and surveillance infrastructure that anyone has ever put together. We wouldn't have half of these problems if the internet wasn't there at the moment. So we need to understand when we build technologies, it's not simply a question of can we build the technological solution to this problem that's turning up. It's can we embed the values that we want to embed into the technology as we build them. And that's where I tie into the social science understanding of this problem, which is why are people around the world censoring information? Why are states around the world censoring information? And the point that I'd like to make, or the agenda I'd like to put forward, is something that I've been thinking about a lot recently, which is to have an approach to understanding filtering censorship around the world inspired by an epidemiological approach, whereby we look at patterns, trends, risk factors that are causing filtering and censorship around the world. Not just the technological infrastructure, but understanding why states do it, how states interact with each other to promote censorship technologies or censorship approaches, and to try to understand how, with the full understanding of the broad context of censorship, we can start to move the internet, move the global culture towards a world we want to see. So in doing that, and tying in back to the ethics of building our technologies, it's very easy to protest or to develop tools against DPI boxes in Syria. It's very easy to say we very much dislike DNS blocking, DNS filtering in Turkey. But there are other tools and other technologies that are less easy to protest against, and that's where it comes into the general infrastructure of the internet. Now, I know that one of Nick's favourite topics at the moment is Encore, the anonymous communication, the censorship monitoring tool that's caused a significant amount of interest in the ethics community around around research into this area. What are the ethical implications of researching into this area? But at the recent SIGCOMM ethics workshop, where OnCall was discussed to a great extent, a number of researchers came forward and said, well, we're talking very much about the effects on humans of conducting network measurements without necessarily their being aware of that fact. But at the same conference where OnCall was presented and where there were ethics considerations, there were technologies to improve anonymous communication tools. John Crowcroft at the University of Cambridge stood up and said, we didn't have a single ethics debate about whether anonymous communications are ethical, whether anonymous communications are something that we should put forward. Now, I'm hoping that the Tor crowd aren't going to attack me physically for having said that. And personally, I strongly believe that anonymous communications are something that is very important. I believe that we've had these debates to some extent over the community in the last few years. But I think that we need to have a broader understanding of the ethics of what we're building and the ethics of the tools that we're understanding and where we accept things like funding from. So without carrying on and with a slightly scatty talk there, what I'd like to say is I think ultimately the thing that's brought a conference like this together is that we disagree by and large with censorship of information on the internet. We wish there to be a relatively high level of free exchange of ideas and information on the internet. I think that in order to do that, we need an understanding of the technological approaches. We need an understanding, however, of the social and political context of filtering, where it comes from, so that we can identify the critical elements that will allow us to engage with that on a country-specific level, on a regional level, and with all the stakeholders who are involved in creating and fighting against internet censorship.
Thanks. So thank you everyone for your very thoughtful statements. I'd like to eventually open the floor here to some questions from the audience, but I'll start with one, and this is actually for anyone on the panel who wants to address it. I think a theme that we heard from all three of our panelists was actually that a topic that we often think of as sometimes we're tempted to think of it in black and white terms, is censorship bad, free speech, open communication good. It's a little bit more nuanced than that. And also the other thing that we heard is the implementation of that, which we tend to think of as sort of binary, is actually quite a bit softer than that. That's something I think that as a computer scientist, and I speak probably for many computer scientists and how I've observed that, we're often not used to thinking about this in such nuanced terms. If you look at the measurement tools, the circumvention tools, etc., Joss mentioned DNS blocking, for example, or IP blocking. And we think about circumvention of a filtering technology. But as Zeynep said, also mechanisms for control are shifting. So my question is, given that this is a technology and policy crowd, what is the computer scientist or network engineer to do in this type of situation? What should we measure? What should we build? Because I don't think we're building that or measuring that right now. So.
Oh gosh, I get to tell my request list. This is great. All right. So there's this weird misunderstanding that activists and social movements really need anonymity. That is usually not true. This is why. They usually actually don't want anonymity, and they kind of counter it. And here's how it works. Leave aside the whistleblower subset, right? They do need absolute anonymity and protection. Most of the time, the act of doing politics as a dissident in a repressive regime is the act of trying to be public and to enlarge your network. So by trying to broaden your network, you are creating a situation in which it's as weak as the weakest link, right? So you are going to get infiltrated. And in fact, you are trying to get heard. Anonymous environments tend to at the moment, empower the regimes that can flood the place with this information. So if you're a dissident in Russia, they won't let you into their group unless you have a Facebook ID that is linked to who you are and you're there as this is who I am. Because otherwise, it's so easy for the government trolls to come and flood the place. This is true in Turkey. People have grown to greatly distrust, for correct reasons, anything that is anonymous for political purposes, exactly because in a post-censorship world, that advantages the governments rather than the people who are trying to be public. That is the act of politics. But here's what they do need. So thank you for asking. I'll give you a very brief story of a Kurdish activist I interviewed in Turkey right after, like about a year after the Gezi protests. His family had been, it's a very tragic story. His family members had been bombed by Turkish military jets as they were on a smuggling run. 30-some people got killed, including his close members of his family. It was censored on television. The news was broken on Instagram when another friend of mine, he traveled to the region and took a picture of the snaking line of coffins. That was just so undeniable. That the media censorship broke. So he went on Twitter after that. And he told me, I want to be as public as possible and I want to be as out there as possible with my name, because he thought that was more protective of him. I said, aren't you afraid of death? No, he's not. He's a young activist. Aren't you afraid of the state? No, what more can they do to me? Torture, he's not afraid. But here's this problem, and this is a real problem. The state is using the surveillance mechanism to make his mom sad about his social activities. Now, this may sound trivial to you. It is not trivial. This is a Kurdish family that has been through 30 years of war. These people have lost a lot of people. He's their surviving son. And whether or not he marries the girl they want him to marry, and whether or not he dates, or whether or not he's gay, are of enormous consequence to these very traumatized people. And the fact that our social tools are so crappy that, that they leak our social information so much is giving the state, and this is actively done, this is not a metaphorical thing I'm telling you, is giving the state a way to really pressure these people. They're not afraid of being out there politically. That is not what they need. What they need is for Snapchat to be really, really secure. What they need is what we need here, which is for our everyday tools to be really secure against mass routine surveillance. They are not under any illusion that the state, when it comes to for them, that the technology is going to protect them. Because, fine, they'll use Tor, but then they'll get tortured. It's like there's no avoiding the state in a repressive state when you're trying to do politics, because that is against the nature of doing politics. But that doesn't mean their everyday interactions should then become fodder for political this. So I would love for the whole community to shift from trying to create what are great for the great, yes, let's do it. Anonymous, whistleblowing is important. But what we need is for the regular tools. And these people are going to use those regular tools. They're doing politics. They're going to use what the person they're trying to reach is using. They're not going to use, I had this conversation last night. They use crappy Samsung phones. I can't convince them to use iPhones. They can't afford it. If they use iPhones, I can maybe convince them to use iMessage. I argued with activists in the Syrian border about how the regime was triangulating their location with cell phone and satellite phone data, and I couldn't convince them to use couple hundred meters of cable because it was a bit of a logistical problem. This is at the pain of death. We cannot convince people not to use everyday tools. Activists need not special tools, nothing thing, and they don't need absolute anonymity, but they desperately need ordinary stuff to be protected, which would benefit us too. So that's like my number one wish is ordinary tools. Number two wish is speedy VPNs. People, you're an activist, I've just seen this happen. You're in place where the journalists have been shut out and you're trying to get out some crucial piece of picture and your VPN is choking, you know what you're going to do? Even if you know that is going to triangulate you, you're going to turn off your VPN and you're going to send that message out, because that is the core function of doing this, right? They're not going to stay safe at the expense of it. And the fact that VPNs are slow, especially in Turkey, people use them and then they go, it's slow, and then they drop them. So 2 wishes: better Snapchat and Facebook encryption, end-to-end everything, and fast VPNs. I'll shut up forever now.
I'll say a few words. Part of it is, obviously our focus here is on technology. What are the technological measurements or possible tools to develop? One of the conclusions I think that this panel is pushing is to broaden the picture. So there may be the complex interrelationships between technology, new tools, and new practices, new ways of doing things. So here's a few takeaways. I think, actually, to build a bit on Zeynep's point, reputational tools are important. It's an anonymity, i.e. nobody knows who you are, i.e. you've got no reputation, is turning out to be a negative. Instead, you want to be maximum positive, maximum identified, and then somewhat known. So it becomes, your credibility becomes important, because there's so much, the new trend in online communication is misinformation, disinformation, flooding the pipes with bad information instead of suppressing. Censorship is giving way to essentially propaganda, if you will. So the credibility, tools to measure or identify the credibility of the speaker are becoming important in this new environment. A second thing I would say, and I don't have the tools, but I can point to the phenomenon, make a distinction between, this is an area I've been focused on a lot, is electronic internet democracy, grassroots democracy using the internet. And my own thinking has evolved, not to the point of coming up with solutions, but to identifying the problem, which is to make the distinction between e-democracy, people coming together, advocating, participating in governance, e-democracy, and distinguishing that from flash mobs. Maybe the internet is a really good way to get a lot of people all together at one point in time with high energy, and that can be actually kind of destabilizing. There is, in democratic theory and the history of democratic practice, the distinction between a mob and an association exists, and it's an important distinction. One is constructive, one is destructive. Sometimes destructive as a step towards construction, but sometimes purely destructive. So some of the tools that have been developed may be at risk of having a negative use for flash mobs rather than building positive democracy. And the third thing, this is completely tool-free, but it really builds on what stuff I'm thinking about these days and what I talked about earlier. There are policies out there that make the advocacy of non-censorship, the advocacy of free speech, less legitimate. And I think one of those is, here in the United States, most of us are American citizens, US policies of regime change internationally, sometimes violent regime change, really undermine the advocacy of democracy, because it creates a dangerous environment in which governments cannot risk experimenting with democracy, cannot risk experimenting with free speech, in which they feel they have to censor and crack down. So these governments may be bad governments to begin with, but perhaps they're worse in an environment where there's significant external threat. We have a presidential election coming up. The leading candidate in one party is actually sort of the architect of the toppling of the governments of Libya, Syria, and Ukraine. One of the leading candidates on the other side is of a family that has been very active in a regime change in Iraq. So even though our issue here is more focused than that, it may be that some of these large issues of policy that seemingly are divorced from internet and so on actually are quite relevant here. To make the world safe for the advocacy of democracy would be a good thing, I think.
So just to slightly differentiate this from the last two discussions, I mean, I would say dissent is not the same thing as censorship, or the creation of dissent in a regime is not necessarily the same thing as being against censorship. So I would argue that sometimes, you know, if we are at a censorship conference, which I think we are, then we need to look at that specific problem if that is what we're trying to approach. So generally speaking, you know, the point Zeynep makes about anonymity and about, you know, reputations and things like that, I think it is important in general political advocacy and general sort of civil society work. But strictly speaking, I think that it doesn't necessarily intersect perfectly with the tools that we want for censorship. I would say at the same time that democracy can be a little bit of a red herring here, because if we look at the policies around the world for control over information and, you know, sort of working against encryption, then you only need to look as far as, you know, the world's biggest democracy over in India, to look at the recent policy pronouncements coming out there regarding encryption. You know, the set of policies that were recently withdrawn, but were being proposed up until about 2-3 weeks ago, was, you know, an increasing attempt to register all encryption algorithms and software with the government. You would have to store plain text of any encrypted communications for 30 or 90 days at an individual level, let alone at a service provider level. Now, these are policies that are coming out of a country that is socially conservative, but it's a strong democracy with, you know, with strong engagement from citizens. So we shouldn't just feel that somehow if democracy is out there that this is going to be the solution to our problem. With respect to the question that Nick put forward, you know, what can computer scientists, what can network engineers do in this realm? Well, like I said in my initial comments, I would say, for a start, requirements engineering. You know, what do your users, what do the people you're trying to help actually need? And don't restrict your users or your target audience to the people that you think you can help. I mean, I think, you know, it's maybe a little bit facile to suggest going and talking to a broad population in China and asking what they think about censorship. But by and large, I don't really know. I have some understanding of the view of people in China to internet censorship, but they're not as up in arms about it as we would perhaps like to think that they were. So if we just go and pick the people that are desperately up against it and ask them what they need, we risk making very sort of targeted tools for very small populations that aren't necessarily going to affect broader social or political change. But if I wanted to speak directly to a network engineer or a computer scientist who wanted a real technical problem to work on, I really think that we need to focus more on our measurement and analysis rather than necessarily our circumvention tools, because I think that understanding of what is happening in various places and how we can build an interface between that to what is going on in the ground in a country, I think that's going to be a much better route towards moving towards an internet we want to see, than restricting ourselves to just building circumvention tools.
Thanks. Let's take some questions.
So I'm all for having people make those decisions. What I'm trying to say is, we don't think of verification as an anti-censorship tool. So we think of anonymity as an anti-censorship tool, and it can be. we don't think of verification as an anti-censorship tool, because verification also allows surveillance, which is bad. Yes, that is true. But at the moment, what a lot of activists say in the Kurdish southeastern Turkey need is to be able to verify and sign that they took this picture right now in this location. So it's this bizarre thing. They need a way to securely, maybe cryptographically sign that it's them, they took this picture, and have the metadata be hard to fake. We think a lot about how do we strip out metadata to help, circumvent surveillance and censorship, which I think is good because people should be able to make the decision to strip out metadata. I don't see the human rights community thinking, how do we help people sign their metadata and make it even stronger as a form of circumventing censorship? Because if the government is censoring by making it very hard for you to tell what's what, the anti-censorship measure is sometimes putting more identifiable information into what you're sending out, not hiding the root of it. So what I'm asking is not no Tor. What I'm asking is also a path in which a person can very positively and hard to fakely identify. Because citizen journalists, they're constantly dealing with this. All the tools, they're stripping out metadata, and they're begging. The people taking the picture and sending the picture are begging for metadata that cannot be messed with so that they can say this is what it was. We don't think of this as reputational tools are anti-censorship tools in a world the governments are no longer able to block information, but able to confuse the public about the nature of that information. So that, does that help?
Maybe even violent agreement here.
Yeah, I know.
That, there are people working on these sorts of technologies to make sure that you can establish the metadata you want. But what you would like to have is that it's in your control.
Correct.
What metadata you
Absolutely.
put in and what metadata you don't.
So Roya in the back seems very eager to comment, and then let's go to the woman in the middle. So.
Actually, I strongly disagree because I think we have to make the communication as anonymous as possible, so many people in this region dare to share these pictures. So then you can confirm based on how many people share that they are accurate or they are not good, rather than having the pictures signed and have the metadata pinpoint the owner of those and give the government of that country direct access to their output.
That's not how it's working out in the practice. I would have said the same thing 2 years ago.
Information is very related to Turkey or open-minded regime like Europe or whatever. But I don't know.
I think we need to be asking these questions and finding out what we need rather than.
Country by country.
Well, these are different criteria also for how do you assess the accuracy of information. So one is a kind of social criterion. Lots of people are sending pictures, therefore they're probably true. And the other one is an individual source. How do you assess if an individual source is true? So these you might have tools that combine both.
But it may well be contextualized in the context of a particular country, which is I think what Roya was
Sure.
saying and was said here is that one country the best approach may be one, and another it may be
Sure.
another. So
Seems like understanding the different contexts and different. I mean, things may be very different in one country versus another. That seems certainly. Let's go to the middle of the room here. Yes.
So I'm going to continue on this debate. I do think we might want to think more about tactical media, but also be more differentiated about how social activists or movements organize and what are the different kind of elements and grammar of that organization. So for example, African American women who were harassed massively on Twitter due to people organizing on 4chan anonymously and using anonymous Twitter accounts, were also using Tor to then watch them on 4chan and make show that they were truthful, right?
I hope it's clear that I don't think I'm arguing at least against anonymity. I'm just arguing that publicity and verifiability are also required in this arsenal to fight censorship in ways we might not have considered as an anti-censorship tool. So there's an absolute place for the anonymity tools, but we have to just realize that is, like, just flooding of information or getting information out does not solve the problem of the public sphere figuring out what is the information we need.
Let's go to Jacob and then Rob.
In terms of tools we use to accomplish censorship and accomplish anonymity, we have a lot of really good computer science and cryptographic tools, public key cryptography, and all of these new the methods we're coming up with that are really interesting. But when you see the policymakers and a lot of politicians start suggesting tools that can apply to these problems, they suggest things like fingerprinting devices manually with hardware, or things like SOFA, or things like filtering and preventing anonymous communications, or a master key so they can unlock and see any account they want. The thing that most of these techniques have in common is none of them work. It seems that in terms of applying policy tools, a lot of the tools that people have been coming up with to restrict censorship or to verify data have been used in government have been the kind of things that won't work or can't work, as opposed to a lot of people who are looking at actually implementing the tools for anonymous communication and for preventing censorship. People separate from the government seem to be relying more on the cryptographic and secure tools that have been coming along.
So why do you think the politicians are making bad technological decisions?
Because there seems to be a disconnect between the policy and the condition.
So that, I think, is the biggest message of what's going on here. But it's not a point. I don't think it's sufficient for the technological community to say, look, we've built it, now you need to come and understand it and use it. We need to go and actively do that boring, horrible work of talking to politicians and saying, like, look, these aren't going to work for these good reasons, but this is what would work, and this is what you're actually trying to do. And that can be really, really hard, and it can be really, really boring when what you really want to do is sit down and develop the new homomorphic encryption algorithm that you've had in your mind. But that's you know, this is why I started my comments by saying, what's our goal? Do we want to stop censorship, or do we just want to build interesting technologies? If we want to build interesting technologies, great. I can think of loads of them. But you know, if what we're trying to do is to engage with this, then it's not sufficient to sit back and say, look, we built the tools. Why aren't you using them?
And
May
keep
I
in mind that
disagree,
tools also, the idea of a tool working in computer science terms and in policy terms are very different. So a tool that's a piece of crap that's not that hard to route around, that anybody who knows a little bit of coding can circumvent, that's a pretty good tool, because the vast majority of citizens in the society can't route around anything. So you can have pretty bad tools that will be relatively effective in enforcing policies.
But may I just disagree a little bit? Far from me to say that politicians understand technology. Clearly, that is not most of the case. But a lot of times, I think what they're doing isn't creating unworkable things, because obviously in a PGP world you can legislate whatever the heck you want, and you know, your terrorist isn't going to be like, oh no, it's illegal in the US. That's not what's going to happen. What they're doing by creating these things, say, I give Turkey examples, you can give other examples. I think it's a move to delegitimize the tools. I think they're fully aware, to be honest, that it's not going to work. I hear this a lot in like foreign media. They think that the Turkish government is an idiot for thinking they can censor things. I'm like, no, they're not. They know exactly what they're doing. They are delegitimizing the medium. I think the US government is trying to delegitimize encryption. I think a lot of governments are very aware that the people who are really going to use this stuff are going to use it. But if you make it an awful tool, something that only child pornographers use, and something that only people who have something to hide use, it lowers the uptake, which allows for mass surveillance. So I think they're a little, yes, they don't understand, but I think they kind of know that their target favorite enemies are going to go use proper encryption, but I think that's not their exact goal.
I just want to say one thing that I've said in many different contexts here, which is Yes, let's all have a good laugh at politicians. They don't understand things, haha. But actually, what I often get when I'm talking about trying to engage with the policy side of things, with technologists, is we need to realize that by and large, a lot of technologists don't understand political or legal processes either. And when you're trying to build tools that are interacting with these worlds, it doesn't make sense to have your, sort of, we call it ladybird book understanding in the UK, kind of, politics 101 understanding of how the government works and how policies are implemented on an international scale, and say, look, I build a tool that I think fits into my very, very crude understanding of the world. I think it's really important for everyone involved in these debates to understand what they don't know, very Rumsfeldian logic here, but we need to, it's like, don't think, because politics seems very obvious and it's going on and I can see that there's a president up there somewhere, that means that there is a good understanding of the full political process. And understanding what's going on at the legislative side, the policy side, the regulatory side, is really important if you want to engage and actually solve these problems. And I think that's a huge thing that we need to do.
Rob?
Thanks, also. My question follows up on that. It's a little bit sovereignty, a little bit process, and a little bit standing. Each one of you in your own way has made an argument for selective filtering, censorship of some sort, or to this media process in place. I think Turkey is probably as fine an example as anything. So what you can find online and not is partially shaped by the Turkish government, partially shaped by the U.S. government and the pressure on technology companies, partially shaped by Twitter and their decisions to push back and how and architecture they put in place. But a huge part of it is determined by technologists who really have no standing apart from their ability to use to generate tools. And a lot of this discussion is based around kind of increasing the standing of technology in a form. That's what we're doing. Are we comfortable with that, or, and maybe that's not even the right answer to ask, but is there a way to put a process in place that balances these various factors in a way that makes more sense? It's kind of a merging of the political and the technological.
I would say that what I just argued was actually for a reduction in the amount of reliance we put on the people that are building the raw technologies. Because my argument is that by engaging with other areas of the debate, then you get that contextualization, which is what I think we're lacking at the moment. So I would say well, I'm not sure you made an actual statement, but I think I agree with the trend of what you were saying. But I mean, on the terms for some level of selective filtering or some level of selective censorship, I don't think there are many people that don't argue for some level of filtering of content. I mean, even here in the bastion of the First Amendment, there are still sort of restrictions. Speech is still restricted in that sense. So, but yeah, I would argue that we need to engage across the broad spectrum of people involved with this society in order to understand that, and that means putting technologists in their right place.
So I'm saying two things,
As a
though.
technologist, I say.
First is I'm saying better filtering is better anti-censorship, right? If the censorship mechanism is flooding, filtering mechanisms become an anti-censorship tool. So it's not like more censorship, it's more like less censorship through better filtering, if that makes sense. And the second thing is all of these things are relationships between people, right? This is sort of this idea that it's a relationship between you and your technology. It's always a relationship between people and what people think is legitimate in the final end. So that's the part I would love to have more technologists, people understand that, for example, in a lot of countries, what is okay to be in the public sphere is an intensely contested conversation between people. And trying to create tools that bypass that conversation doesn't really help the bypassing that conversation either, because people will then find other ways to shut down that conversation. They will stop going to that place. So it doesn't really accomplish the goal. So it's a question of how do we bring the political process into the very discussion of the tools we're building. So I'm totally there. It needs to be completely merged. The people who do both have to be in the same spaces. Ideally, they have to be the same people.
Let's close with one.
Okay,
thought.
well, last comment. I've been doing this for 25 years or 30 years. Many in this room have been doing it that longer. Others are doing it. The merging of the technological, the technical, and the policy, or the technical and the social, it's a significant ongoing, it's a process of technological development, but it's a process of social learning as well. We're seeing changes in the people who are using the technology, who are learning how to use the technology, learning what works, what doesn't. We're seeing institutions like all our universities, and Princeton is a great example of this, its curriculum and its focus merging the technical and the policy. So without commenting on the specifics of how we bring technology and policy closer together, we're seeing an awareness of the process, institutionalization of the process, and the building of that capacity. And we're sort of part of this ongoing process. It's been going on a long time. It will continue to go on. And we're part of that now.
On that note, I think we should head to the break. I see there are more questions, but we should definitely continue the discussion in the break. And then our next panel will start in about 10-ish minutes. And that will be on assessing the state of internet accessibility. Thanks.